Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Tuesday everybody. First up, let's discuss the unfolding of what is increasingly being called the fourth Taiwan Strait crisis. We've been following the military exercises every day, so let's briefly touch on these and then move to the wider regional geopolitical and diplomatic developments. As we alluded to yesterday, Beijing has confirmed that it will extend the military drills around Taiwan into this week. We remember that the original 4 days of live fire exercises announced after the Pelosi visit in Taiwan a week ago today were initially set to end on Sunday. Yesterday, more exercises were announced, including anti-submarine drills. In addition, the PRC's Maritime Security Administration also announced 5 exclusive zones in the Yellow Sea, where exercises would take place from August 5th to 15th, as well as an additional 4 zones in the Bohai Sea, where unspecified Chinese military operations would take place for a month starting this week. The Washington-based Center for Strategic and International Studies China Power Project has produced excellent resources for following the unfolding crisis. Analysts with the China Power Project argue that these unprecedented exercises serve at least 4 main objectives. Now quoting the analysts, first, they are intended to impose political costs on Taipei and undermine morale and support for Taiwan President Tsai Ing-wen among Taiwan's public. Second, these exercises are part of larger Chinese deterrence and signaling efforts towards the United States, Taiwan, US regional allies, and the broader international community. Third, these exercises allow the PLA to rehearse how to conduct a variety of military operations that could form part of a PLA blockade or invasion of the island. And fourth, again according to the analysts, Beijing aims to use the exercises to establish a new status quo in the Taiwan Strait. Meanwhile, there is also an escalating diplomatic crisis between Washington and Beijing. The Foreign Ministry of the People's Republic of China has formally announced that Beijing would be 1. Cancelling China-US theater commanders talks, 2. Cancelling China-US defense policy coordination talks, 3. Cancelling China-US military maritime consultation agreement meetings, 4. Suspending China-US cooperation on the repatriation of illegal immigrants, 5. Suspending China-US cooperation on legal assistance in criminal matters, 6. Suspending China-US cooperation against transnational crimes, 7. Suspending China-US counter-narcotics cooperation, 8. Suspending China-US talks on climate change, as well as several other measures. Unsurprisingly, China maintains that this is all completely the fault of the United States, with a PLA spokesperson expressing yesterday, quote, "The current tensions across the Taiwan Strait result solely from the provocations from the US side. Thus, the US side must take full responsibility and face the grave consequences." End quote. We remember, with the current ideological environment in Beijing in recent years, most officials believe this point deeply, and it is part of the wider worldview in the capital. One Beijing official, for example, speaking to Singapore-based The Straits Times, expressed yesterday, quote, "The US-led NATO provoked Russia to attack Ukraine. Now the US is provoking us to attack Taiwan." End quote. Beijing is in the process of launching a major global campaign to push this position too. Now, China may see some success in these efforts in parts of Latin America, Africa and South Asia. However, in East Asia and in the West, these diplomatic efforts will likely see little to limited success. Indeed, some of the messaging to Western audiences in particular have already been clumsily delivered. For example, in an interview with French broadcaster LCI discussing the Taiwan crisis, China's ambassador to France expressed that after unification with the mainland, the people of Taiwan would need re-education and re-sinification because Taipei had, quote, indoctrinated and intoxicated, end quote, the population with anti-Chinese education. International diplomatic and media efforts will continue, however. The PRC has launched a comprehensive diplomatic campaign to paint the US and the secessionists in Taiwan it supports as the culprits for the current tensions. Wang Yi specifically cited 3 mistakes on the Taiwan question by the United States, though he opens the door to the US mending its ways. What would an acceptable mending of its ways by the US to the PRC is a bit unclear, as it increasingly sounds to me like the PRC side is saying what is acceptable is to reset the status quo back to the understanding way back before the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act, which of course is unacceptable to the United States." End quote. The so-called three mistakes listed by Wang Yi, as articulated by state-run Xinhua, are 1. The US side grossly interfered in China's internal affairs. 2. The US connived at and supported the Taiwan independence forces. And 3. The US deliberately sabotaged peace across the Taiwan Strait. In the same speech, Foreign Minister Wang Yi also accused Taiwan's leader Tsai Ing-wen of betraying her ancestors and her race. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, a draft bill called the Taiwan Policy Act is currently moving through Congress. If made law, the act would significantly expand US government support of Taiwan. US media outlet Politico writes that the legislation, quote, represents the most dramatic shake-up of the US-Taiwan relationship since the Taiwan Relations Act, which has guided US policy on the subject since 1979, end quote. It authorizes $4.5 billion in security assistance to Taiwan and gives the island the distinction of being a, quote, major non-NATO ally, end quote, of the United States, among other provisions. Okay, that is the Taiwan crisis, which we will be continuing to follow this week. Let's move on to the Chinese economy. And for the Chinese economy, let's start with some positive news, then move on to some mixed news, and end with some ugly news. The China Passenger Car Association has raised its forecast of domestic electric vehicle sales this week, now predicting that EV sales in China will hit a record 6 million this year, more than double the 2.99 million new electric vehicle sales China saw last year. The revisions were made after China saw strong sales of new electric vehicles in July. Indeed, overall passenger vehicle sales rose 20% year-on-year generally in July. Car makers are certainly doing much better now than in Q2 of this year, when the Shanghai lockdown smashed logistics chains. Renewed subsidies in some regions have also helped. The central government has lent a hand too. In May, Beijing cut purchase taxes on some low-emission passenger vehicles by 50%. And this wasn't the only promising news on the vehicle front this week either. Chinese internet giant Baidu Inc. won approval to deploy the first fully autonomous self-driving taxis on Chinese roads, beating domestic rivals Xpeng and Pony.ai. Permits have been provided to operate the self-driving taxis in the cities of Wuhan and Chongqing. Baidu said in a statement that 5 Apollo 5th-generation robo-taxis will be rolled out as trials in each city. This number will be slowly raised to 600 nationwide by the end of the year. Baidu also has a 6th-generation version in the works, which, the company claims, costs nearly 50% less than the current version to make, introducing a massive cost advantage over traditional human-driven cabs. Now, moving from cars to trade, new data from China Customs indicates that China's July trade showed stronger than expected exports and a record trade surplus, though imports were very weak. According to the data, Chinese exports grew by 18% year-on-year in July to $333 billion. This is great news, right? Well, analysts are divided on this point. Zhang Zhiwei, chief economist at Pinpoint Asset Management, speaking to Hong Kong media yesterday, expressed that, quote, the strong export growth continues to help China's economy in a difficult year as domestic demand remains sluggish, end quote. However, Peking University professor of finance Michael Pettis, who anticipated a huge trade surplus with weak imports, disagrees, writing yesterday, quote, it is precisely because the Chinese economy is performing so poorly that export growth and the trade surplus are so high. China's trade performance is a symptom of the problem and not a locus of strength in an otherwise weak economy, end quote. Now, finally, let's end with an update in the housing crisis, and this is quite an important update to cover. It is now clear that Beijing has decided that it must step in to bail out large parts of the crisis-hit property sector, choosing short-term stability over the policy objectives of deleveraging and fighting moral hazard. Greenland Holdings, the largest developer in Shanghai, said in a statement yesterday, Monday, that it has received loans worth $500 million from city government-backed firms to, quote, ensure its smooth operations, end quote. This news coming just a few days after China's massive state-owned bad loan disposal firm Huarong announced that it would help restructure the debt of another large developer in the country. Analysts argue that after months of developers bleeding, hemorrhaging even, it was the mortgage boycotts which really spooked regulators in Beijing, who recognized the real risk of financial crisis and social instability if the movement spread. However, as we have discussed before, the property sector is so large that government bailouts, even massive ones, can only really stop the worst of the bleeding. It's not enough to bring the sector back to life. As the above-mentioned Pettis has expressed over and over again in recent months, you cannot take a sector that comprises such a huge share of economic activity and such a huge share of household wealth and cut it down to size without reducing economic activity and perceptions of wealth. Hey guys, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, and for anyone who wants to go the extra mile and help support me continue making these episodes every day, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. I really want the channel to be primarily subscriber supported and not have to rely on corporate sponsorship, so this is a tremendous help. That is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much everybody for watching. Thank you very much for the ongoing support. I'll see you all tomorrow.